Welcome to Philosophy for Living on Earth, coming to you live from the Ayn Rand Institute. This is a weekly webinar series exploring life's big questions and the answers to those questions coming from the ideas of Ayn Rand. I'm Elan Journo and I'm your host this week. Our big question for today is, does success in life require compromise? So the format for these sessions is that I'll give a presentation for about 15 or 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A and discussion. Really want to hear your questions and feedback. With me today is my colleague Keith Lockridge, who will be moderating the Q&A, and he'll be joining in as well. By the end of today's webinar, you should come away with a greater clarity on the role of compromise in your quest to build a successful life. So I think we can all agree that compromise, or situations that call on us to compromise, come up all the time in every area of life. We engage with people and we want one thing, they want another thing, and we don't always see eye to eye, so we have to figure out how to navigate those kinds of situations. And many people think, and I think with good reason, that compromise is often a good thing, or it's really important. The world goes around and you need compromise to fuel it. Without it, nothing can get done. Well, one expression that you hear is, to get along, you need to go along. And here on the screen, I've just captured a couple of headlines that convey this view. There are a lot of articles on the web you can find suggesting how important compromise really is in life. It's a virtue, it's a guiding principle of social life, and there are tips on how to improve your personal relationships by becoming better at compromise. Why it's so crucial. Now, I think up to this point, most of you probably are nodding and saying, yeah, we get that. No one's going to push against that. But then when you think on it for a little while, people start getting uneasy because it's not clear that every compromise is a good compromise or is a good thing to do. And people then start reeling it back and saying, well, okay, well, compromise is a good thing. It's a virtue. It's important in personal relationships and work and politics. We get that. But then there are lots of cases where it doesn't seem like it makes total sense to compromise. And you get people saying, well, hold on a second, you should never compromise. There's things, or just as a principle in life, you should not compromise. Now, this puts people in, I think, an understandable quandary, because it's, on the one hand, there are lots of cases where it makes sense to compromise and other cases where it doesn't. So if you ask people when or how should you figure this out, well, it's sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not. Or the answer is it depends. Well, there's lots of qualifications. And just to underline this issue, part of what makes it complicated and difficult is probably a lot of you have experienced situations where you've compromised on some issue, but later you think back on it, and maybe it's in a personal relationship, and you think, well, that really didn't go the way I thought it would. I'm not happy with the results, and more than that, I don't feel I was true to myself in an important, deep way, and you could see negative effects of that. And notice as well that as much as people talk about compromise as this virtue, that there's always situations where you should compromise, notice that the word also has really negative connotations in certain usages. So if people say, oh, he compromised himself, they don't mean he did the right thing in kind of finding common ground with someone. They mean he did something really bad. Or if you think you're going to fly to visit your family and you say, do you want to get on a plane that has a compromised inspection history, or its maintenance is being compromised in some way? So we get that there are crucial ways in which compromise means a bad thing. And so let's try to unpack that a little bit. So when should you compromise, or when shouldn't you compromise? And I indicated earlier that a lot of people's attitude is, well, it depends. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. So that really doesn't answer the question, because an it depends is just a gate, and you need to walk through it and figure out, well, what's the next question? How do you know? So the question I want to push on is, well, how can you know when you should compromise? What does it depend on? What do you need to know in order to kind of navigate this kind of situation? When should you give in, and when should you stand your ground? That's what I want to sort of focus on in the next few minutes. And to do that and explore this issue, I'm drawing on an article that Ayn Rand wrote called "Doesn't Life Require Compromise?" And I'm putting on the screen a link to it on our website. You can go read it for free right after this webinar. Don't leave right now. Go do it later. And I really encourage you to go and read it. It's not that long, but it's really rich in philosophical insight. And what I'm going to suggest, building on some of the points in her article, is that if we take her analysis of compromise really seriously and kind of rethink it through, it helps us distinguish between the compromises that are good, that lead to win-win outcomes and positive relationships, and versus compromises or situations where it doesn't lead to that. It's really bad outcomes. Well, let's start with just what's a standard dictionary definition of compromise. And I looked this up the other day, and this is what I found. It's, quote, an agreement or settlement of a dispute reached by each side making concessions. So you're resolving some issue by each side giving some ground. Okay, that's just a description. It doesn't really guide you. It just tells you what we're talking about. But notice it doesn't, it includes both kinds of situations, both the kind of compromises where people think, yeah, this was a good outcome, and the ones where people resolve the disagreement, each side giving ground, but it turned out badly. So it includes both the good and the bad kind of things that we have in mind. So this is where I think Ayn Rand's insights on compromise really help. And I'm putting here one of the formulations she has in that article. She says, quote, "It is only in regard to concretes or particulars, implementing a mutually accepted basic principle, that one may compromise." So what I really want you to get from this is that the crucial element I want to draw out is that there has to be a mutually agreed principle or shared value context. If I can formulate it slightly differently in my own words, there has to be some common ground that is meaningful and substantive. So it has to be shared value context or principle. Okay, let's just walk through a couple of simple examples and flesh this out. So you and a friend have been wanting to get together for coffee for a long time, and you both have very busy schedules, and you're trying to coordinate. So there's a lot of text going back and forth. Can you make it Monday? Can you make it Tuesday? What time? And what you end up with is you can meet on Saturday morning, but there's a very small window. And she has a commitment in the afternoon. She has to drive off somewhere, and there's a very short window of time. And you have stuff right before that. So, you want to meet close to 11. That works for you. And she needs to meet close to 12. Okay. Well, so you can't have both of those times, and you really want to meet. So what do? Well, it turns out that 11:30, somewhere in the middle, actually works, and it's a win-win outcome. So you both so in a sense, you're compromising on the time you want to meet. You're not getting the exact time you want, but you're getting something that works for both of you. Now, and I'm sure this happens all the time. I mean, when I'm at work, when I'm scheduling meetings, there's always a back and forth, and you kind of find something that's mutually agreeable. But notice, just to take a step back from this situation and say, what is the common ground here? What's understood? What's the basic value context that's shared? And I think it's fairly straightforward, and it's usually unstated, but let's just make it explicit. It's that you and your friend each respect each other's time, and you value each other, and you recognize that you have other commitments beyond this coffee meet, and that you're not going to violate those and expect one person to completely throw their schedule into disarray and do something that is really not going to work for them. So it's a crucial element of this value context is that it's a true relationship of equals. They're actually friends and they value each other. Okay, simple example. You see how there has to be that context where we agree that we're going to meet at some point on Saturday, but the details, we can shift those around. Take another example. You want to buy a used car, and you have a budget. You want to spend around $6,000, and you find a car at the dealer, and it is $9,000, the sticker price. It's a good fit. It's what you want. And so you talk to the dealer and say, well, look, I want this car, but I have a very limited budget. What can you do for me? And you negotiate back and forth. And some people are better at this than others. you end up with, you're able to buy the car, but it's a little bit more than what you hope to spend. You end up paying about $7,700. And the dealer is getting less than what he asked for. The sticker price was $10,000. But you're both getting what you want out of this deal. It's a mutual benefit. You both recognize you're better off at the end of it. And notice here, and this happens all the time, of course, right? This is a very simple kind of case where there's a transaction involving money and a product or a good, in this case, the car. Now, again, stepping back, what's the common ground? What's the shared principle here? There's a number, but let's sort of isolate a really crucial one, which is the principle of trade, that you have to give value for value, and both sides have to agree voluntarily to be part of this transaction. So they have to be part of it voluntarily, and they have to recognize that what they get is a value. And if they don't, they just walk away. There's no obligation to finish the transaction. He can wait for another buyer to come along. You can go to another dealer or just find another car. So crucial here is that there's a shared value context and a shared principle that you're both, and again, it's usually it's understood, or it's not really brought to the fore, but it's important to conceptualize it. Okay, but that's in contrast to situations where that is missing. Well, there's no value context, no shared principle, or put another way, as Ayn Rand puts it in her essay, there can be no compromise on basic principles or fundamental issues. No compromise on basic principles or fundamental issues. So you can compromise within a value context, but you can't compromise on the basic principle itself, or the basic issue. So let me dramatize that for you. So this is an example from a workplace. And imagine yourself a biology teacher, and your department head comes to you and says, you know, I've been trying to work out your request to get some microscopes for the classroom, and I can approve a few of them, but I need you to make a compromise with me. I need you to give some ground on something with the curriculum. I don't think the curriculum is sort of what you're teaching is as good as it could be. So what I need you to do is, when you get to the section on evolution, I want you to talk about evolution in a particular way, and I'll give you some notes on what that looks like. And I want you to talk about this idea that I think it has a lot of merit and it's scientific, so it belongs in the curriculum. It's called intelligent design, which means, basically it means that it's a conception of evolution where there's some kind of God-created origin. Now, whatever your views are on evolution, and I happen to think it's a well-established theory, in this story, you, the science teacher, happen to be really informed, you know, firsthand. It's your objective judgment, your rational conclusion that evolution is well-established, and that this intelligent design stuff that your colleague is trying to have you inject into the curriculum is nonsense. It's a fairy tale. It's fantasy. It's a religious view. It doesn't belong in a science curriculum. So you know that this is not true. You don't want this in your curriculum. You don't think it will improve the students' learning to have this injected into their classroom. But at the same time, you need these microscopes because that's part of what the classroom experience is. You can't really teach certain material that way. So she said, well, look, she summarizes this for you. We both give a little ground, and we both get something. You get the microscopes, and I get to see the curriculum improved, and the students get a better outcome. Now, what do you think of that? Is that a compromise that is within a shared principle? Or is it a compromise on the principle? I think if you think on it, it is a compromise on a principle. It's telling you, the science teacher who knows and believes evolution is right and true, she's saying to you, your colleague, no, you have to put aside your fundamental understanding of this truth and instead do what I'm asking you to do. And notice that there's kind of a superficial appearance that you're both gaining something. You're getting the microscopes and she's gaining some conception of an improved curriculum. But the reality is that there's no common value context. She doesn't really respect your judgment or your integrity. And she's asking you to violate your intellectual integrity in this case. So this is a compromise on a principle, and it's wrong. It has no place in a successful life. It leads to really bad outcomes. So that's a kind of an example where that value context is missing, where it's a compromise on a principle. So just to summarize where we are so far, so the key point I want to draw out from Ayn Rand's essay here that I think is incredibly helpful in guiding our thinking and our action in life is that there's a big difference, a legitimate compromise or a true or a genuine compromise, a valid one, a good outcome, a good compromise is one within a principle. It's within a shared value context, as opposed to what people describe as a compromise, but is not. It's a betrayal. It's a selling out. It's a compromise on a principle. And that's where we get sort of the negative connotation for this idea. And I think this is a really helpful way to think about this issue. So, you know, in this webinar, just for pedagogical reasons, I'm using examples that I think are really simple to get to the core of the point. But when we live our lives, our experiences are not isolated and essentialized for us in this way. And so, you know, apart from obvious cases like a mafia guy comes to your shop and says, you know, I'll protect you if you pay me a cut of your proceeds, or someone in the really extreme cases where it's really clear cut, like someone takes your kid hostage and asks for ransom. Those are clear cut cases where we can say, look, you're trying to make this seem like a compromise, or you're trying to make this seem like a trade where we're both benefiting, but it's not. Now, life is mostly not those kinds of extreme cases. It's mostly cases where we're called on to people are suggesting that we compromise with them, but it's not that clear how is this a good decision to make. And I want to just indicate two, and there's many other reasons, but two reasons why it's difficult to tell when we're compromising within a principle and when we're compromising on a principle. So the first reason is that it's rarely presented honestly as a you lose, I win kind of deal. That's rarely the case. And most often it's packaged or it's presented to you as, well, look, you're going to benefit a little bit and I'm going to benefit, and we just have to give it a little ground. So it has the trappings or the superficial appearance that both sides benefit. So it looks like a kind of equal transaction. Think about the example I gave with the high school teacher. So that's one reason. It's hard to untangle what are the different things going on and to get at the core of the meaning of this kind of experience. And the second reason, I think, is that people don't fully appreciate the role, the crucial role in life of principles, and especially moral principles, to guide them. So to the extent they're aware that they need to live by principles, or they have some principles, they're not really well thought out. It's unusual for people to have well thought out principles. And so if they're asked to surrender a principle, they might dimly sense something is going wrong here, but they won't get that what I'm being asked to do is to give up my understanding of this issue, my view of what's right in this context, and in effect cave in on this. So there's both the unawareness of how important principles are, and then sort of as a consequence of that, there's no real appreciation for the fact that there are really negative consequences to surrendering on a principle, to what I'm describing as an invalid compromise, or a compromise on a principle. So I want to give you sort of a very quick example, and you can ask me more about this particular concrete in the Q&A, and I hope you will. I wanted to pick something that's actually happened that you can look up in the news, research it if you're interested in the details. I'm going to give you a very abridged version of it. And it's from an area that I study, which is foreign policy. So I want to tell you in about 90 seconds, I want to tell you sort of the story of America's attempt with its allies to form a, quote, compromise solution with the North Korean regime to end North Korea's nuclear program. So you probably heard about this in the last couple of years. Donald Trump, the president, has been trying to restart this kind of deal. But it actually started many years ago, more than 20 years ago. And the first deal that was brokered was under President Bill Clinton, who is pictured here, announcing the first round of these agreements. So again, this is a very abridged account of a detailed, involved story where what I want to draw out here is it was presented at every stage as a mutually beneficial trade of equals, where there's a shared value context, and the compromises were presented as if, well, it's just a little small thing that we're giving up. We're not violating our own principles. But the reality of it was, in fact, completely the opposite. If you look at the character of North Korea, it's a dictatorship. It's hostile to its own people. It starves them to death. It has turned a whole nation to slaves. You can't leave North Korea. It is a really horrible regime. And its nuclear program is not for any purpose but aggression. It is a really, and it's sold its nuclear technology to other bad countries. So there's a real self-deception here among the people who are pushing for this deal, including the fact that North Korea has a whole history of deceptions and violating past agreements and lying. So essentially, this was a case of extortion, but presented as, no, this is a civilized country meeting another civilized country, just hashing out the details, as if you were buying a car. There's as if there was some understood value context when there isn't. And the outcome of this, I just want to kind of give you the progression of how this played out. As you would expect when there's a compromise on a principle, the outcome was really bad. So just in outline, North Korea started out in the early 90s. It was clear that they were a menace. They were building these long-range missiles. They were threatening. There was good evidence to think they were developing a nuclear program. And everyone who was sensible would say, this is not a good idea. They shouldn't be doing this. We should try to find ways to stop them. So it started off with North Korea being a minor threat or a small threat or a minor menace. And so there was a deal in 1994 under Clinton called the Agreed Framework. This led to a sort of, quote, compromise deal. North Korea got some aid in exchange for dismantling some of its nuclear facilities. But that led to North Korea becoming a slightly bigger menace because it claimed to stop its nuclear program, but it didn't. It continued developing, and by 2006, it had not only developed a nuclear program, it had tested a nuclear device, thanks to its continual lies and deception. Okay, zoom forward. Another deal is reached under a different presidential administration, and again, this is it's presented as a compromise among equals, sharing value context, and it's a win-win outcome. And again, the same thing happens. North Korea then has a series of nuclear tests that it does, each of which is much, much bigger. And so by the time you get to 2017, North Korea's nuclear tests are a factor of 100 more powerful. So it's managed to develop a device that essentially a doomsday device. And the essence of this story that I want you to take away from this is what these supposed compromise deals actually did by giving North Korea aid and food, and in some cases helping it build a civilian nuclear power plant, is it helped encourage North Korea's aggression and irrationality. And it pushed us down the road to the point where it's really hard to turn back now and try to fix this problem because we've fed and nurtured it all this time. And that's one of the consequences of a compromise on a principle. And again, I'm just to sum this up, this is a very abridged account of the story, but the key thing I want you to get is that we made the problem worse by compromising on a principle in this context. So that's one of the key points I want you to get, that in thinking about this, we have to be sort of really unpack a situation and think, what is being compromised? Is it a compromise within a shared principle or on a principle? That's a really helpful way to think of it. So just to wrap up, I want to summarize the key points I left with, 3 takeaways. 1, a compromise is possible only when there's a mutually shared principle, a common value context. Number 2, a compromise within a principle can enable win-win relationships and interactions. That's the kind of thing that we all want to have and use to navigate our relationships in our life. But 3, the third point is that a compromise on a principle is really destructive. And it can happen it doesn't always happen instantly. It can happen over a long period of time, but it puts you on a trajectory to really bad outcomes because it means selling out your principles and your own fundamental beliefs, violating your convictions and values. So my suggestion, if you have time after this webinar, go to our website and read Ayn Rand's own account of this. And I've just touched some points, not the whole of her argument. Doesn't life require compromise? An excellent essay. It's really helpful in thinking through this kind of issue. And then she has other essays on compromise and the role of principles in life, which you can find in her books. And of course, if you haven't yet read Ayn Rand's novels, I think there's a lot to learn, particularly from The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, on the role, what it looks like to have these bad or unprincipled compromises in your life, and the importance of integrity to one's rational beliefs. I think that's really vividly dramatized in the stories. So I want to give you a heads up that next week here will be my colleague Ben Bayer. He will be asking another big question, which is altruism a virtue? I hope you can join us for that. You can sign up for this series at our website, and the URL is on the screen. The short version is bit.ly/ARI-webinars, and you can also find it on aynrand.org. And of course, we'd love to get your questions. I was inspired to answer this question: doesn't success in life require compromise? In part because I was moderating Keith's webinar a few weeks back, and this question came up in the context of his discussion. And we always look at your feedback. We'd love to get your suggestions going forward. So write to us at webinars@aynrand.org if you have one. And right before we get to the Q&A, I want to just ask you guys how much you've read about Ayn Rand. It's really helpful for us in assessing our program. And if you could just respond to this poll that I'm putting on the screen right now, I'd love to get a sense of where you are in your understanding, how much you've read about her views, and so on. So I'll leave that on for the next few minutes. And now we will have Keith Lockett join us. Hey, Keith.
Hey there, Elan.
Hey, how are you?
Good, thanks. That was a good presentation. I found it really interesting. We've already got a few requests for just clarifications or points of clarification in the talk. So Pooja is asking, can you go back to your slide with the compromise within a principle versus a compromise on principle quote? She'd like to see that. I think she wanted to take that one down. And then we have Nick asking on the example, I guess, with North Korea. You're saying the first compromise was America giving aid, and he was asking what was the second one. Well, what did America concede on the second compromise? If you could just repeat that for clarification.
Okay, so if the specific quote is this one that can you see it on the screen right now?
Regard to maybe Pooja, you could let us know if that's the slide you were looking for, or is it the pink one?
Okay.
But in any event.
Oh yeah. So on the North Korea example, as I said, I was giving a very abridged account of a detailed, involved story. If I remember correctly, I think the first round in '94 was an agreement where North Korea would get some, I think, oil and I think maybe money in exchange for dismantling some of its equipment and submitting to international inspections of its facilities, including, we want to know what you're doing here, and we'll put cameras in place. What happened after that is North Korea ejected the inspectors, and there was a crisis. It launched some missiles. The next round involved, I think it was the next round where part of what North Korea wanted was help in building civilian nuclear power facilities, which it actually got the US and its allies, including Japan, to help fund and develop these nuclear facilities. And I think at various points, the material benefits that North Korea demanded varied, but they're basically of the same kind. It was either grain, it was oil at various times. Sometimes it was just international aid. But then one of the themes throughout these negotiations was North Korea constantly presented itself as the one that was fearing aggression from other countries. And it demanded things like diplomatic recognition and a promise from other countries not to invade it, which, I mean, there's all sorts of things to say about that. But the important thing is that it wanted both respectability, diplomatic respectability and legitimacy, and also material means by which to support itself, to prop it up, to feed its army. Because a lot of the aid that has gone to North Korea has gone to feed a massive army. It has one of the largest standing armies in the world. But what I would suggest, I won't go on this because there's more to say, but I would suggest that the questioner, if there are a lot of resources on sort of the history of the North Korea relationship and the attempts to find a deal, and you can find itemized for each step. And I hope I've got the right stages here for what they were asking for each point. But it's easily found on the web. I would recommend looking for that.
Okay, and just super quickly, it was the pink slide with your quote that Pooja was looking for. But let's turn to the one with the compromise on principle versus compromise. Yeah. All right. So yeah, that's the one. Okay, so we have a bunch of questions coming through on the Q&A module. First one is from Brad, who's asking, he asks, is compromise necessary in the early stages of forming a friendship, in the sense that you have to extend yourself in order to get to know someone new? And as I understand the question, it's sort of like when if you're just getting to know somebody, you know, maybe they're pushing you out of your comfort zone. They want to go hiking and you're not a person who goes hiking. Is that a compromise, or would you describe it as something different?
Yeah, so I think it's helpful if having established a context earlier in the presentation, let's say that a compromise is when you have a shared value context and you're just adjusting on the details, on the particulars within that context. So it's a legitimate thing to do. It's valid. You're not selling out in any meaningful way. And I think if in that context, if your goal is, I want to spend time with this person and get to know them, and what they're suggesting that you do is not something you've done before, it's not something you're sure you like, or maybe you don't like it all that much, I don't think or maybe it's inconvenient because you're not that fit and you don't want to go hiking. And I think all of those things are really details which I think it would be fine to say, look, I'm not sure I'm going to love this, but I want to get to know this person. This is my goal. And they're interested in getting to know me. Maybe I'll like it, maybe I won't, but I'll get to know this person. So I think it's fine to do that. It's within a context. Now, where this part of what I would suggest in thinking about this is look for patterns in this sort of thing. So if you become friends with someone and it's always on their terms, like they want to go to a nightclub, you hate nightclubs, and they want to go and they drive crazy and you don't like being in a car with people who drive like that. Or whenever you meet, it's only on their schedule and they disregard your needs and there's something unequal about that. And it's something, and sometimes that's a sign that this is not a relationship of mutual interest. So, and that can become a situation where you're compromising on a principle. And the issue would be, you're an individual, you're entitled to your judgment and your values and your interests, and you shouldn't have to be in a position where you're constantly surrendering those, because I think that's where it becomes an unprincipled compromise, because it's, well, I'm always doing what this person wants to do, and you grow to resent it, and that's not a healthy situation to be in. And just one other thought on this is, I was reading on this because I wanted to get a range of examples that people talk about when they're trying to puzzle out when should I compromise and when shouldn't I? Because I think as I said, I think it's a really pervasive question, and it's not obvious in any given case. And I was reading about a woman who was describing a boyfriend that she moved in with. And yeah, he pushed her out of her comfort zone. And then it became, well, I don't like it when you wear really sexy outfits when you got it, because it makes me think that you are looking for other men. And she wasn't, she just liked to wear certain kinds of outfits. Or I don't like it when you go to yoga on Saturday morning, because I like for us to have Saturday morning. And so she said, okay, well, I won't go to yoga. And there's a whole series of these things. And by the end of it, she thought, well, why is this person controlling my life? Everything important to me, like he's cut her off from her friends, from her activities. And the values that matter to her were being eroded. So there's ways in which relationships can start off with, yeah, we're just trading, this is a valid situation. But then notice if it's going in a certain direction and what you're being asked to give up is things and people that are really valuable to you, or beliefs, because often it can be kind of a gateway to other behaviors that you don't want to be in.
Yeah, and if I can engage in some shameless self-promotion, I think aspects of this question also come up in the webinar that I gave a few weeks ago, I think, which was the one that you said we got questions that inspired this topic. So the webinar on doesn't love require sacrifice, and I go into some of these issues about relationships and when is it legitimate trading and negotiating versus are you actually being put in a position where you have to sacrifice and it's not healthy for you or for the relationship. So. We got a lot of questions coming through about principles. So you're talking about the difference between compromising within a principle and accepting a shared principle versus compromising on your principles. And so that's prompting people to ask, can you give a definition of a principle? Can you differentiate between what's the difference between having principles versus having standards? What's the difference between a concrete and a principle? So do you want to go into a little more abstract discussion of what exactly is a principle and how do we differentiate that from concretes?
Yeah, there's a lot to say on this topic, and I would suggest, so I'll say a few things on it, but what I would encourage people is to the extent you're going to spend more time learning and thinking about Ayn Rand's ideas, this is a really key aspect of her philosophic outlook. I mean, it's all over her writings, her nonfiction writings. It's all through the fiction that principles, to be principled in life is crucial. And it's actually a virtue to be conceptual and principled in life. And she has a really profound analysis of that. So I just want to stress that this is a big topic. It's very important. And I'm just going to say a few quick things on it. So off the top of my head, the definition, this isn't going to be word perfect, but I think this is accurate. A principle is a fundamental truth, a generalization that covers a lot of ground, and it's a truth that other truths depend on, and it has wide implications for your life. Now, there are principles in different areas of life. There are moral principles, which help us understand, sort of gives us guidance on how to act and make decisions. There are principles in math, there are principles in computing, there are principles of writing. The principles exist in all areas of life, and it's important to get that that's true. Now, if you think of a principle as a kind of a wide generalization that captures a truth about life or about a particular area of life, it's going to give you, it's going to be something like, I mean, let's take an example from ethics. So the virtues in the objectivist thought are themselves principles. They're particular kinds of principles that guide your action. And what they tell you is, for example, to be independent. So this is the virtue that Howard Rourke in The Fountainhead embodies. It's to have a primary orientation to reality, not to other people. That's a really broad abstraction. It's like, well, in every area of your life, in everything you do, that you should focus on the facts first. And it's not that you don't care what other people think. That's not the primary. You have to judge what they think by reference to the facts. Now that's a principle. Now a concrete, or as in contrast to that, is we were setting up earlier today. Let me give you a very simple concrete. In setting up the AV and the screens, we have a very complicated setup here. I was asking Keith, well, am I sitting in the right place? And because I can't see myself. And so what I ended up doing is I turned the camera on so I could see. Well, yeah, I trust Keith, but I also want to see with my own eyes what's actually happening. Or, the camera, the positioning of the camera. So it's the concrete as well. Yeah, but I need to know firsthand what's happening here. That's a very minor kind of thing. Now, let's take, just to build out one further aspect here, and maybe we can subdivide some of the questions you've got and narrow it down. So if you think of the example I gave of the school teacher, where he's being asked or she's being asked to go against her judgment of what is scientifically true and inject something she knows to be wrong. Now, there's both a negation. So let's unpack what's going on there. So just a couple of things that are going on there. The principle there is that you should be true to your rational beliefs. That's what integrity is. That's a wide principle. And in the context of a workplace, it's, well, you should go by what you judge to be right and true and stick to it. And that means having integrity. And most people would agree integrity is a good thing. And Ayn Rand has a distinctive conception of how important that is. But if you peel back one more layer, the integrity here is this person who is a science teacher has spent years training in science. They've read the firsthand evidence. They've looked at the evidence about evolution. They know it to be a well-established scientific truth. They've looked at the geologicals, they've read Darwin, they've read people after Darwin. So there's a whole body of knowledge that they have. And what they're being asked to do is to go against what they know is true. So they're being asked to throw out that whole value context. Like, this is what I know is right. And they're being told, chuck it out the window. So from one perspective, yeah, they're being told, forget your integrity, that doesn't matter. So that they're throwing away that principle. And in the specific, what are they being told? They say, shut your eyes to this truth and instead accept the truth or accept this claim from the creation, what do they call it? Intelligent design creationists. So I hope that helps sort of parse out a little what is a principle. It's a broad truth that guides action or guides our thinking. And then the particulars in a given case, how does that relate to that principle? And there's many principles involved here, but I'm glad people are asking about this because I think this is a key to thinking about how we navigate these relationships with other people.
And just to add to that, I'll second your recommendation that people look at Ayn Rand's article, Doesn't Life Require Compromise? Because it's a really, really short article, but she packs it with all kinds of examples where she's saying, you know, this is not a compromise, this is a compromise. You know, and one example that I thought was particularly interesting was she says, you know, if you're a writer and you've written a work of fiction and you get suggestions from your editor, you know, to make changes to the novel, but you agree with them and you're the one who's going to make the changes, that's not a compromise. But if they're asking you to write trash so that you can acquire a huge following, so that once you're rich and famous, you can, you know, then write the novel that you want to write after you've acquired a following of people who like your trash, you know, that would be a compromise. And that latter thing is the kind of compromise, or the kind of, you know, you talked about the novel, The Fountainhead, and it's very interesting to watch Howard Rourke's story, the protagonist in that novel, because one of the themes of the novel is the issue of integrity. And, you know, does he achieve his success in spite of not being willing to compromise? Or is it because he's unwilling to compromise? And that's an interesting take on that.
Yeah, one thing I would just build on that, Keith, one thing I would say is I formulated the question for the webinar slightly differently from her essay. And it's because in the essay, I think she's responding to people who are coming to her thought and her philosophy with the assumption that being uncompromising is going to be a problem. And it's a common view today, as much as people think compromise can be bad, they also think being uncompromising is a problem. And Howard Rourke is definitely uncompromising on his principles. And so she's answering that. So, and I think it's important. I wanted to sort of to open the context a little more widely about the role of compromise in life. But yeah, I agree. I think the story of Howard Rourke is fascinating from this perspective. And for those of you who have read it, some of you, judging from the polls, I think have some awareness of the story. Think about, to try to integrate this with your own experience and think, well, what would it look like to be uncompromising? Well, I think a precondition is to have some principles that you think you should live by. And Howard Rourke really is one person who's really thought about what he believes in architecture and how he wants to conduct his life. And if I can sort of reverse that point and put it in the positive, I think for Ayn Rand's conception of when should you compromise and when shouldn't you, sort of a premise of her view is it's really important to know what you believe. It's really important to have consciously held principles and convictions to guide your actions. And when you have them, you're much more attuned to when a situation is a compromise you can engage in and when you shouldn't engage in it, because you know what's at stake and you know what the consequences are.
So that's a good segue into another question from Emmett, which is, what is the function of principles in human life? Why are they important? Why do we even need principles?
Okay.
That's a big question. But
that's a big question. Let's put that on the list for a future webinar. Yeah. I think it would be a wonderful, and I'm not dodging the question. I will say one or two things on it, but I think it's a really profound question. I think the way into this issue is to see sort of Ayn Rand's conception of what it means to have a human life, what it means to live as a human being, as she says, to live a life appropriate for man qua man, sort of in the fundamental sense of what it means to be a human being. And in her view, we are conceptual beings. We live and act and guide ourselves with our conscious mind, and we have to have an abstract perspective on our life. We need a kind of a framework of ideas that will tell us how to judge good from evil, how to judge the right course of action in a given context. And this is what a principled perspective is. It's having a framework of, so just to put principle in a sort of maybe more familiar terms, a principle in this context is a generalization, a general truth about what you should and shouldn't do. And it's super helpful for guiding life. And the contrast to that is happenstance or arbitrary decisions, or sometimes you think you know what you're doing, sometimes you don't. It's not a path to success to be making decisions in the absence of a principled perspective. So that's sort of the kernel of what I think is unique to her view. And that, I mean, you can put it a different way, is Ayn Rand has an essay, Philosophy Who Needs It? And that's the same kind of issue, which is, in order to live your life, you need to have explicit conceptual understanding of what's important, what's true, what's false, how to know those things, and what's good and what's not, how to understand the application of that in various areas of your life. So you need a philosophic or a principled perspective in her view. So she's not just in favor of principles, she is, but she's in favor of sort of the widest principles you can have, which is philosophic principles in guiding life. So what I'm going to say is, for the person who asked that question and others interested in it, read, and I think you can find this on our website, read the essay Philosophy Who Needs It, because it makes what I think is a really powerful case for the importance of having a conceptual, sort of a principled perspective on life. And it's a key to understanding why she places such emphasis on principles. And the other thing I would say is, for those interested in seeing how this plays out, she has another essay called The Anatomy of Compromise. I was rereading it last night. It is a brilliant illustration of what it looks like when you go against your principles, or when you're not really clear about them. And so this goes to the questioner's interest in what does it look like and how does this play out. So a lot of recommendations for you to look into that. And I think we should have a webinar on that issue. It's a really fascinating one.
Yeah, I wanted to just add to that a little bit in terms of what role do principles play in our lives. And I agree that there would be a good webinar topic, but just to, if you don't mind if I take a minute or two to add a little color to that. So if you think about scientific principles, think about, you want to land a spaceship on the moon. So you've got a broad principle, Newton's laws of motion and gravitation, and they're very broad principles. And if you apply them, you can calculate the exact trajectory you need to send the spaceship up. And it's a causal principle that allows you to predict, if you send the spaceship off with this speed, at this angle, and this sort of thing, then over time, it will get to the moon. Well, there's a similar thing with moral principles. they're, you know, they're causal principles that allow you to project the consequences of your actions. So for example, Ayn Rand's view on honesty, you know, she doesn't have the 10 Commandments view, thou shalt not lie, right? Just as some sort of out of context absolute. What her principle of honesty does is it says, if you are dishonest, and here's what will happen, here's what the long range consequences of that will be, of that attempt to deny the nature of reality and to pretend that the unreal is unreal. If you do that, you're cutting yourself off from reality, and over time it'll have these kinds of consequences. And it's a very similar kind of thing. It allows you to predict what will happen, and you can see the negative consequences of it by doing that. So that's the question was, what is the role the principles play in human life? They're ideas that allow you to predict the consequences of your actions, so you can you can make choices that lead to better long range outcomes in your life. So
yeah, I hope this won't be at the risk of confusing people. So one of the points I was making in the example of North Korea is that when you make so this is actually a principle, when you make an unprincipled compromise, as this example argues, you end up with very bad outcomes. You end up encouraging evil and sort of dictatorial regimes that are hostile, and you make them more hostile. You feed the evil, you feed their rationality, and that's a broad generalization about the sort of the consequences of when you cave in and when you give ground when you shouldn't.
Okay, so we've got a couple more questions here and a little bit of time to try to get these in. Is there a distinction between compromise and consensus? This is from Nandan. Let's see, the question is the definition that you gave, maybe I think he's saying it sounds a little bit more like consensus than compromise. How would you differentiate those two?
Yeah, I think of consensus being more an agreement on some issue, and it can involve compromise. But I think
it's what you reach by means of legitimate adjustments, mutual concessions, and so on.
It can be, but I would say I think consensus too can be one of those terms where it includes both good consensus and bad consensus, because I think there is such a thing as elevating consensus above truth. So I would say that be careful in using that term as well, and think about, well, how did this consensus come about? Was it a rational process? And were people giving ground they should or shouldn't have? So I think they're related. Off the top of my head, I can't give you a very sophisticated distinction between the two. I would need to think about that some more.
I mean, just to add to that, I think today when we talk about consensus, it has a lot of the same problems that come up when we talk about compromise, because, you know, people talk about scientific consensus on certain issues that basically requires people to, compromise on their scientific principles in order to join the consensus and so on. But that, we don't want to raise a whole can of worms there. Last couple final questions here that are related. So there's a question about how this applies to oneself. So can you compromise with yourself on principle, as opposed to two people having to adjust to each other? Is there a way that you can compromise yourself? And then a similar question from somebody else, you know, if you yourself have lived on sort of mixed premises, have you compromised with yourself?
Okay, well, let me take the first question. I don't think of it exactly as a compromise, because I think that generally is in relation to other people and their demands. But you can engage in the same kind of error, which is to violate your own beliefs and principles in the conduct of your own life without someone pushing you to do it. You can, one situation would be you're asked what you think on some issue, and you have a definite view, but you decide, well, I'm afraid of raising my voice, and you don't do it and you betray what you know to be right. So yes, there are cases where you can be unprincipled in action, and it's not because you're compromising with someone else. But in that sense, by an extended sense, you could say you've compromised yourself. So I don't think it requires another person to be unprincipled. And there's many cases where people do that. They cave in on what they know to be right, or they don't have integrity to their beliefs and their values. And that you don't need another person to push you into, though that often is how it happens. I think just remind me of the second question.
It had to do with
mixed premises and
mixed premises. Yeah, can you sort of compromise your own life in a way?
Yeah. So this is a question that I think is coming from someone with a fairly well-informed view of Ayn Rand's sort of theory and her philosophy, and the conception that the premises people have are important in defining both how they act and their emotional life, their thinking, and so forth. And I think in Ayn Rand's conception, having mixed premises is both a common phenomenon for people, but it's also something that one can take steps to change and sort of integrate your views and your premises around rational ideas. So the one thing I would say on that is it's important to think about which premises you have that you think so mixed, which ones are the ones you don't think belong, and think about how to remove them. Because yes, acting on mixed premises leads to inconsistent results. And I think it's not ideal as a path to a successful life. So I would leave it there, because I think it's a question that assumes a great deal of knowledge, and we don't really have the time to flesh it out. But it would be a good webinar topic too, is how to think about your own premises and check them, to echo Ayn Rand's phrase.
I think we've got just about a minute here, but
so while you're looking at the questions, let me remind people,
sure.
Next week's webinar, we really hope you can make it. Ben Bayer, our colleague, will be here, and he will ask the question, is altruism a virtue? And I think that I hope people will find that provocative. I think it is a challenging question. And Ben's he's thought a lot about this issue, and I think you'll find the webinar well worth your time. So I hope you can make it. And again, if you have questions for us, either that you think we should answer in the webinar, or you have feedback about the webinars, drop us an email, webinars@aynrand.org. We read everything you send, including all the questions that are posted in a given webinar. Even if we don't answer them, we read everything. We really are interested in your perspective. Do you have time for one more question, Keith?
There was a point of clarification that a person was well, maybe it's not clarification, but it's so on the teacher example, we have an anonymous attendee asking, so if a teacher's in that situation, what sort of choices do they have? I mean, I know that's not, maybe it's a little out of scope, but it's like, what does somebody do in a situation? How do you, I mean, this is a question, if you're put in a situation where being asked to compromise, what options do you have?
Yeah, I was thinking about that when I made this example, because I'm not actually sure it's legal for the head of school to ask that anymore. It used to be illegal in some states. Yeah, so I think that's a case where, if I were in the position of the science teacher, I would push back, and I would look for support outside the school if I had to, because to the extent you have to work in that kind of context, you have to be in any context, but especially in a context of a sort of a state, if it's a state-run school, as most of them are, I think you have to be diligent about your integrity to the extent you can work in that place. It can't be at the cost of your own integrity. And this is an issue where I don't think it might come to the point where you say, well, I can't be in the public schools if this is what they're teaching. But I think it's one of those things where you have to stake your ground. And I mean, in my work, I find that if people have clarity on what they understand to be true, and they understand the value of principle, it gives them the courage to resist. And resist doesn't always mean have a big blow up. Sometimes you can nip these things in the bud by just being assertive and confident in your own views, and establish that you're not the sort of person who can be pushed into this sort of thing. So there's lots of ways to handle it. I'm not saying it's a trivial thing to handle, particularly if it's a superior. But it's important to get that there's a range of things, and often it's easier than it might seem. sometimes it's easier than it might seem to resist it.
Okay, well, we're right at the hour here, so that sounds like a good note to end on. Do you want to say any final remarks?
Well, just thanks to everyone who came today, and for all of you listening on the podcast or on YouTube. We'd love to have you join us live, and again, love to get your feedback on questions you want to see answered, and or questions that you have after watching one of these episodes. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for joining. Ben will be here next week. Goodbye.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to never miss a video.